So hey there, thanks very much for my videos here on YouTube. Today we're using the live still on the old YouTube channel there. Essentially, it's the easiest and simplest way for me to make a quick little video without any editing, no script, just a simple sit down, point to point type conversation. My idea here is to basically get enough content together at some point after I've run a Turo car for a year to build a little podcast, probably about 12 episodes, and kind of going through the process of what Turo is like in Southern Ontario. So essentially, these are very raw, unscripted, just a straight conversation about kind of what's been happening with me and my Turo car and my experience as far as being on the platform. I've also been taking some general questions and a few other little things that have just kind of popped up or emails out to kind of other folks that are kind of in Turo, or they've been doing it for a few years, or they're just starting out as well. So I thought I would share some of their experience and do some of their questions and answers, that type of thing, as far as things that are related to me. So in other words, it's not written in stone. I'm by no means an expert, but it's just my way of increasing my speed of learning, essentially, so that I can kind of go through and go, oh, you know what, so and so had that car and they made that same mistake, and or they've been into it for 2 years, and maybe they flipped into a different insurance company, or maybe they changed brands and models for a reason. So again, we'll probably get into that a little later, and we'll have a conversation. Then I get you up to speed, but it would be really great if you could subscribe. So let's do that little PBS moment, where you hit the little button down below and get all this wonderful content, technically for free, which is surprising considering the amount of money I've spent on this setup, which is, you're in my little 3D printer studio space. So I'm a hobbyist. I do 3D printing, and some of my artwork is hanging on the back as well. So I do Canadiana, that type of stuff. So again, just a hobby, things that I seem to enjoy. And I've kind of rolled into Turo with the kind of same kind of perspective as going, okay, I'm going to give it a shot and just see how it works and go from there. But at this point, with one vehicle, and kind of working through the process and getting kind of that skill set up, it is more of a hobby than anything else from that standpoint. So with that said, if you could subscribe, that would be great. Right now I'm sitting at, I think, 285, which is pretty decent considering it's a very small market. I don't think Turo has much of a presence in Canada. I think most of the information that I've received, the stuff that I've kind of viewed, has all been US folks. So again, I've tried to mirror what they're doing down there with what would be considered a cash car. I think it's the easiest way to get into Turo. Basically, down there, the idea is to spend around $6,000, get yourself into a reasonable vehicle that's 8 to 10 years old, something that's the equity has basically come down to the bottom end of it, and now the depreciation is kind of a nice straight curve instead of getting a brand new car where you kind of go, okay, great, and then you just go and drive it off the lot. You've lost 20 to 40%, which is really hard to recover on Turo. Even if you've got a high-end exotic, it's going to be a struggling point to get that 40 points back. So starting off small and getting familiar with Turo, getting into that $6,000 to $10,000 car, gives you some opportunity to make some mistakes without setting you back too far and causing a lot of issues financially. And if you are reasonably car knowledgeable and you've got yourself a little bit of a background where you can do some of your service work, do some of your own repair work, you can assess the vehicle on your own, kind of sort through the costs of how that particular vehicle services, and maybe you've got knowledge on that particular model you're driving with, or you're using a vehicle that you're going to rotate out, or maybe it's a third vehicle, and you're going, okay, well, I can farm that out and start making a little bit of that, make a little bit of money on it, or perhaps cover the cost of insurance or servicing the vehicle over the year, right? So that's the idea from that standpoint. If you're on YouTube and you're doing a little search for Turo, you're going to find a lot of little things that go, oh, get rich quick type deal, and get yourself up to 30 or 40 units, and be a multi-bazillionaire. In the Canadian market, I don't think that's really the case. Now, if you are a Canadian out there, you can say, hey, Keith, no, I've been running, and this is the process that maybe you've been using, and maybe you are up to 10 or 15 cars. Maybe that is a project that seems to be working well for you. And if that's the case, send me a little, heads up and say, hey, check out my stuff. I'd love to, as far as that's concerned. But from the things that I've been checking out, given our limited market up in this neck of the woods and our insurance costs, our vehicle costs, a few other little things, it's a tighter market to get into. So I guess if you're going to compare states, maybe it's like trying to get into Turo in North Dakota, maybe something like that, or maybe it's like being Turo in Wisconsin. I'm just trying to find parallels, but it's definitely not like Turo in Florida. It's definitely not like Turo in California. So those are things that just we don't have that marketplace or even that supply of cars to really kind of say, hey, let's drop down to the point where you can pick up a nice Santa Fe for $4 or $5 grand. They're not out here in that neck of the woods. Okay, so that's where you're at from that standpoint. So again, I thought I'd go through some questions. So I'm gonna just kick over to I've got one screen set up where I kind of watch the camera and watch my audio level with this. It's going to kick it over to a series of questions, kind of like my little teleprompter. So we'll go from there. Okay, so you get to watch me read. That's going to be fascinating. Again, down the road, I'm hoping to turn this into a podcast, which is why I haven't really spent any money on studio space or cameras or proper lighting. It's basically just a shot, right? And I figured it's such a small market that if I do get up to 500 subscribers, I will go ahead and I will buy a better camera, and I'll probably get a better I'll probably get a little backdrop that says Turo, or I'll get a imprint of a car or something behind me, as far as that's concerned. If we get to 500, until that point, it's just basically a conversation I'm trying to do weekly, and go from there, right? So let's go ahead. Okay, so pros and cons. This is just kind of a general little run through. Some key questions and things to consider if you're getting into Turo in 2025, which is where we're at right now. So again, first question is kind of brand recognition and demand. So again, in Canada, what I have found is that Turo is not readily known. It's not as big of a marquee or a name or a brand that I think you'd find in the States. So in other words, there's still a big learning curve up here for it. I think the general market is a little bit limited, especially if you're in, I'm going to assume the prairies. So if you're out in the middle of like Saskatchewan or you're in Regina and you're kind of thinking, let's get into Turo, it'll be big bucks. Again, I'm not 100% knowledgeable on this one. Maybe you'll be the only one out there. Maybe you'll have market dominance. Maybe that's what will happen from that standpoint. Don't know. But you wouldn't be able to rely on Turo heavily for booking. So it'd be one of those things where you'd say, okay, well, I'm going to use these as an insurance provider to get your foot in the door, and maybe use them as a booking agent to kind of keep you covered as far as that's concerned. But I don't think there's enough there to be able to say, hey, you can rely on Turo 100%. You'd have to actually get out there and really try and market your cars on a local level, almost as if you'd be a Turo host, but you'd want to put like, Sarah, the Turo host, or Tim, the Turo host, actually market in your region as a peer-to-peer. And that's one of those things where I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm in a small little community outside of Kitchener. It's in Atwood, so we're talking tiny. I get a little bit of a run from the Kitchener area, which is interesting. So my experience so far is I don't do well on the daily, and I don't do well on midweeks, but I do really well on weekends, and I seem to do okay on 10-day and 14-day bookings. So I think most folks will do that extra 45-minute drive out to Atwood if they're in Kitchener or Guelph to pick up a car if they're getting a discount for a 3-day rental, or if they're going on a 10-day or an excursion. So I don't have any limitations. So I've had a couple conversations with clients where some Turo hosts have, I wouldn't say declined them, but have made the hurdles a little bit harder to get into their car when they pointed out that they're going to go cross-border shopping, or if they're going to take it into Quebec, or if they're going on a road trip up north. Now, the way I look at it is they're insured. I set for a certain amount of kilometers, so as long as they're within that kilometer range, I'm okay with it. And to the most part, I like that 3-day and a 10-day booking. The single days, like if I were in Kitchener and Guelph and doing a single type, Wednesday booking, now I've got to do the paperwork. I've got to clean up twice on that car. So really, I understand you make a little more on the daily. I get that. But I think for the effort that you have to put into it, you have to really be set up for that. And I think probably in Guelph and Kitchener, it's probably real easy. It's probably one of those things where you can just whip around the corner to probably Suds or the local car cleaner and get your vehicle cleaned at a very competitive, by competitive, I mean market-driven price, because there's a fair bit of them out there. Whereas I'm in Atwood, there really isn't a car detailer. There isn't anybody that I can kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, I need this done in an hour. Whereas if I were in Kitchener or Guelph, I could probably go to Suds and literally go through the drive-through and be done with it, right? So I think that's where the limitations are as far as that's concerned. So how do I justify my listing for being in my area being small? I justify it from the standpoint that I'm not looking at it from wanting to be booked out 30 days. I'm looking at from I'm shooting for a 15 to a 25 day booking. That's kind of my goal. It'd be a real win for me on that one. I'm trying to get a little bit of business that would be out of the rental area from here. So we've got a couple car dealers that do rentals, and we've got one name brand rental place, and they tend to be mid-sized cars, a couple pickup trucks, a fair bit of minivans, and they don't really have anything in my category, which would be a 7-passenger non-minivan. So they're into things like Escalades or bigger SUVs, which tend to fetch more money. Whereas if you're a family of 5 and you kind of go, I need the third row to haul around a 7-year-old and a 13-year-old, and you want to go up to Owen Sound, well, my car's a lot cheaper. Like that's what it boils down to, and it'll serve the purpose, and it's not a minivan, which seems to be the argument when people seem to be having a conversation about why they're picking up a little SUV or a mid-size SUV, is they're not minivans, right? So that's what seems to be the hurdle there. Plus the all-wheel drive, you got snow and things and ice and stuff up here, so this time of year it's good for that. So that's how I justify my listing in my little region. Okay, so are renters aware of Turo, and are they comfortable using it over traditional rental companies? So this is interesting. So this question here is it's kind of loaded to a certain extent. So the clients that I've been dealing with usually they have a hurdle with an international driver's license, which if you're going through Tilden or some of the local car rental places, they have an issue with that. So it becomes either a surcharge or it becomes an issue of availability for cars. So they don't say they won't take it, but they'll make it really difficult for you to get through that. Plus they'll ask for more information. So a lot of folks will go, okay, well, they'll just move around that. And that's what I find with my Turo is I'm getting a lot of international drivers. The other one is that availability. So in other words, they may have a lot of little SUVs. They may have a fair bit of mid-sized cars, but they don't have that third row. So it's one of those things where if they do have a minivan available, it's usually overbooked. The other one is a lot of folks don't want to be in the minivan because they're looking from the standpoint if it's small kids in the back, they would sooner have the all-wheel drive and the ability to go up and down a country road without any real hurdles from that standpoint. Ease of setup and payment. Okay, so this is a question here. So I found it very easy to set up on Turo. Wasn't a struggling point at all. Now, I originally went through Turo before I went and bought my car. So in other words, I already had kind of an idea what they wanted as far as vehicle listings are concerned. So I shop within that category. And I think that's key, is to do a little research beforehand. So I looked from the standpoint in my neighborhood, what would be an issue for a renter. And I had a couple of folks at work who were trying to rent vehicles, and they ran into some struggling points, which is why I looked at Turo, along with kind of bumbling across it on YouTube, where they had issues where they were going, well, I can't get into a vehicle because of credit restraints. They didn't have a credit card. They couldn't get into a rental vehicle because the rental company was booked, and they had an insurance voucher, essentially a credit for that particular company. They couldn't go anywhere else. So we're kind of pooched on that one. I thought, well, Turo's a good alternative for that. So there's got to be a small market for that. I was just looking for that tiny little piece of the pie. In other words, I'm not looking to dominate it. I just want to get that offshoot, that, hey, I couldn't quite get it done there, I can get it done here. So far, I've found that the international driver's license seems to be the key thing. So again, it's a lot easier through Turo to be able to book a car, get confirmation on Turo for coverage. As far as if you've got a vehicle, make sure you call them and say, hey, this is what I'm doing. And it seems to be pretty straightforward. My concern is just that the insurance is covered. Turo payments. Is the payment system reliable, fast enough to support steady cash flow? Yes, I would say, yeah, it's pretty good. So I haven't had a payment held for 30 days. It seems to be 2 days after the rentals. Everything seems to go through pretty straightforward, unless you're trying to arbitrate something. If you put something in like a damage claim or anything along that line, that payment can be held up a little bit. At least that's what I've experienced. So it's one of those things where if they're still going through that hurdle of trying to do a repair, and this is a double-edged sword. So the insurance I have through Turo is basically I think it's a 75-25 split, right? So if it's under $200, I would say don't bother claiming it. It's not really worth the hassle. And if it's something you can repair in your driveway and it's relatively straightforward, like for instance, I've had to do a side skirt and I've had to do a little bumper repair. Those things I would probably suggest. If it's over 250, at least in my market, I've got to go to a shop and they're always lined up for work. I'm going to be down with that vehicle for probably 14 days, just trying to get it into a body shop in this region. If I go to, let's call it blow-in or a mobile guy, they don't want to come out to this neck of the woods. I've got to drive in. That becomes a bit of a hassle from that standpoint. And typically they're going to be a handwritten receipt. It's going to be a stumbling block with Turo as far as getting that claim through anyway. So it's one of those things where it's kind of, unless it's a big claim, it's not really worth it. So I've been debating doing that 90-10, to be honest with you, at this point with it. But it's one of those things where I felt comfortable by saying, okay, well, I want a little more coverage, so I went with that. So yeah, I'd say cash flow as far as the payments are concerned are pretty straightforward. It's nothing really earth-shattering from that standpoint. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, claims and insurance options. So how does Turo's claims process work, and is it trustworthy enough in real-world scenarios? So again, I haven't had any major claims to go through. I've had a couple little situations where I've contacted them and said, hey, I've got this issue with the host, and just to document it and put everything in place. But I essentially waived the damage because it was an easy repair. I haven't had the point where there's been a major dent or ding or collision to have to deal with. From what I understand, as far as the reviews out there, it can either be a straightforward, easy task with no headaches, or apparently it's an off-a-rail crazy moment. Usually it's directly related to how you've done your documentation, and that's really key on the initial pickup. In other words, you've got to get those 72 or 100 plus photos in and say, look, this is what my vehicle looked like prior to rolling out. It has to be really well documented from that standpoint. I'm in a 10-year-old car, so it's a little older, so it's got scratches and nicks and dings already kind of on it. So I'm not too worried about little nicks and scratches. But if you were into, let's say, a brand new vehicle, less than a year old, that would be one of those little things that would probably give me hesitation on listing that car, especially if it was something you were attached to. Whereas my vehicle, I look at it from a standpoint of it's a daily driver. I even make it very clear in the ad as far as it's a great vehicle to run up to Owen Sound. It's got a couple nicks, a couple little scratches. It's going to be a nice, straightforward transaction for you, no headaches as far as that's concerned. And that's kind of how I build mine out. Same thing with when it comes back and it's a little dirty, I just clean it. I don't charge for what would be muddy floor mats and a general wipe down. Whereas I noticed that at least some of the reviews on Turo, apparently some of the hosts do like to bill for those things. So it's one of those things where I kind of allow for some wear and tear. So you should be able to kind of openly say in your mind, oh, okay, I'm going to put this out there. I'm going to expect a ding. I'm going to expect a mark at some point. Now, if you want to run with it and try and chase them down, by the time you've done that, I think you're going to lose out on a rental, which means that in all likelihood, you've lost that $200 or that $500 that you would have had to spend out anyways. So it's kind of a moot point from that standpoint. Major collision, I would probably say, yeah. Insurance plans, again, it comes down to the type of car you've got. So I've got a car where I feel pretty comfortable at the 75-25. I might even go 95-10. But if you're in a really decent car, you kind of go, no, I want to make sure you're completely covered. Maybe 60-40 is where you want to be. But it would be a personal choice on your standpoint as far as that's concerned. Are the deductibles reasonable for my financial risk and tolerance? That comes down to your personal choice. It's fine for me from there. And again, I can kind of offset it by going, okay, I can take care of some of the minor stuff myself as far as that's concerned. Like if I had to, I could get a bumper painted and put it on, that type of thing. You might be limited and not able to do that. So that's one of those things where it's a judgment call. And it also, what does that car mean to you? Like, is it your primary transportation? Is it a car that you put a ton of money into and you've got a passion for and you're a hobbyist and maybe you like to share that? But at the same time, be aware that um, they're rental, they're treated like rental cars. So they're not really driven with love and care. I'm not saying that they're abusive, but you're out there as far as that's concerned. Um, Market research and expanding potential. Okay, so this is a weird question. In my location, is my location? Yeah, I don't quite understand that question, but I think it boils down to this. So if you're in a low demand area, and if you're in a small rural community, um, I can't predict what your demand is because you don't have a rental agency. So the way I looked at it, because I'm familiar with the car dealerships here, I looked at it from the how often their loaner cars went out. So a GM dealership has 14 units. They bill back GM anywhere between $17 and $37 on a warranty claim for the vehicle they send out, and they're always out. Right. Again, a lot of that is in-house and related to warranty claims and work that they've generated, but they're steady. The folks across the way are a rental agency and a body shop. Their body shop supports their rental business to a certain extent. In other words, if the car is in there because it's been in an accident, or they're offered up a rental car through them, right? So they kind of cater to their clients. But at the same time, when I drive by, I think they run about 15 to 20 cars, and there's never more than 3 to 5 cars in their parking lot. So there's always 10 to 15 out on a fairly regular basis. And then just feedback from, again, folks at work who've tried to rent cars. It just said, hey, there's definitely a market here in my region, even though it's small, to be able to do that. So if you're in a tiny little town in the prairies, or if you're kind of in a little spot kind of further north in southern Ontario, where you might be the exclusive provider for rental vehicles with two, like, you know what I mean? Like you could be, little fish, big pond type deal, right? So that could be where you're at. So it's one of those things where if you've already got a car, the risk is pretty limited. You might want to try because you're not renting an office, you're not getting special space for it. It's one of those things where it's kind of a home base to a certain extent. You can take advantage of what you've got already. So I think you'd be better off actually in a smaller community opposed to having to compete kind of as a one-off in Guelph or Toronto or larger centers where you can see that there's a lot of vehicles available on Turo. In which case it becomes very competitive, and you're going to have to say, okay, now I've got to carve out that little niche. What am I going to do, right? Partnerships with, so this is the big thing that's coming down with Uber and rideshare programs. I'm a little hesitant on that, to be honest with you, because I'm renting, or I was thinking I was renting to um, families, weekend getaways, 10-day bookings because their cars are in the shop or because they're doing service work or there's warranty claims or they're here on a vacation, that type of deal. When you're doing Uber or food deliveries, you're really renting like a fleet. So you're putting a lot of wear and tear on that particular vehicle. Now, I'm kind of fortunate. I think that if you were an Uber driver, you would look at my vehicle and go, V6, that's a lot of gas, right? All-wheel drive, that's a lot of gas. So I think I'm kind of out of that. But if I were running a small compact or a mid-size SUV, like a 5-passenger with a 4-cylinder, I think I'd be more in that marketplace. Just like as an Uber driver or as a food delivery guy, I probably wouldn't go with my vehicle, just as far as that's concerned. But at the same time, they're sharply discounted. So if I'm getting a food delivery guy, he's taking advantage of the lower price points and the promotions that are provided. So it's one of those things where I look at the amount that I'm going to take in on that car, and it's going to be abused. Like that's just the nature of it. If you go look at any food delivery vehicle, they're all riddled with dents, dings, the tires are bent to bits. Like it's literally going to be a real wear and tear item. So it's one of those things where I think they're trying to expand the marketplace to give you a little more options as far as what's out there for rental. But I think if you're running something like a Mitsubishi Mirage, I think you'd be more concerned. But that's my thoughts. Well, who knows? Maybe you're getting that crazy food delivery guy, or you're getting that crazy Uber guy who goes, yeah, it'd be really cool to have a Porsche for the day to deliver McDonald's. And I don't see how that would work for him financially, but everyone's a little different. Is there a demand in my area for ride shares, delivery, and friendly rentals? Again, that's another question someone's kind of sent in, and it's one of those things where you have to look at the demographics of where you're at, compare what the other businesses are doing. In other words, hop in your car, drive around, have a little peek at. If you can find out where the loaner section is on your local dealership, or if you can find out where um, your rental company is and drive by every couple of days and have a little look and go, oh, well, there's 10 cars there on a regular basis. Maybe you're a little slow, and look at what inventory they carry. So for a good example is I had that Cruise. Well, my GM dealership has Cruise vehicles or Cruise-like vehicles. The rental company has that type of car, and they're brand new. And to be honest with you, the price points weren't that far off. It's one of those things where they really drop on those ones real quick as far as pricing is concerned, especially if you're doing a 14-day rental through an insurance company. They really factor that down to the point where you kind of go, well, for the 15 or the extra $30, I'm probably going to go to a newer car. So it's one of those things where it doesn't quite work for me in my area, but it may work somewhere else. But it's one of those things where you kind of want to be off that little beaten path a little bit and say, no, I've got that third row in the back that the other guy doesn't offer, or I've got that sports car that the other guy doesn't offer, which another can of worms to deal with on that one. But I'm not doing sports cars for a reason. And we're into questions about luxury and exotic rentals. So if I own a luxury or exotic vehicle, does Turo offer the best rental platform for maximizing profits? Well, that's a good question. The problem is I think they're the only ones in Canada. So it's one of those things where else do you go? Like they'll offer you the insurance, which I think is very important. So in other words, they're the insurance provider. You'd want to probably get off their automated pricing and set your own pricing and see how that works for you as far as that's concerned. I haven't done a lot of research into things like what does a top-end BMW get, or what does a top-end, super luxury vehicle get. I'd be concerned again because a scratch or a nick or a crack or a bang in a car, which is going to happen, becomes very expensive on the exotic cars to repair. Whereas if I'm dealing with a bread and butter vehicle, I can go get a blow-in, which is basically a very cheap cosmetic fix where they wet sand down to the color, touch up, and they re-clear coat, and they're mobile. And a good example would be like a company called Colorworks, where I can get away with doing $150 or $300 repair that on my vehicle would look appropriate. Whereas if I were running a beautiful Bentley with a pearlescent paint and floating metallic, I'm going to a special shop and I'm going to be paying a premium for that, which means I'm going to go through insurance, and that becomes a hurdle, right? So is it good for exotics? Maybe it is in the GTA and the greater Toronto area, and maybe in Montreal, where you get a little different clientele. But I think up here, it's predominantly back roads, poorly serviced main roads. It's SUVs, right? So again, something you'd want to research if you're the type of guy that has a bunch of exotics. I'd be hard pressed, to be honest with you. At least I don't know that to be experienced enough to be able to say, hey, yeah, it's a great idea. But it's one of those things where I would probably contact somebody on Turo, maybe go rent an exotic car, see what their process is like, and go from there. Are there any other rental platforms better suited to high-end vehicle rentals? You know what? I haven't done any research, but there's really limited in Canada. There really is not a lot to pick from. If you're out there and you go, no, Keith, I do high-end exotics or mid-range exotics, and these are the companies that I deal with, I would appreciate a little link or a feedback on that one. Okay, so we're going to talk about some cons. So mandatory long-term discounts and low earnings. So I've already experienced this one. So automated pricing, once you get kind of past that comfort level, you're going to want to assess. Basically, if you're going into long-term discounts, I had an experience where it was almost 70% off. Well, it was 70% off listed. So it brought it down to the point where I had already had discounted the vehicle for the month. You throw a 70% discount on top of the discount, it's not worth it. It's one of those things you're going to go, you could drop the package right there and forget Turo. It just wouldn't work. So it's one of those things where you have to be really careful on long-term rentals, because that's really where you're going to lose some. And that's even on my low end, under $10,000 car. I'm looking at going, wow. And I did that on my last video. So it's something to review as far as numbers are concerned. It boiled down to where I was bringing in $8 or $9 per day on a long-term rental. It's wear and tear and depreciation and the whole bit. It just eats away. And then you throw a little insurance cost onto it. You're not looking at huge margins even to begin with, even on like a 3-day or a 2-week rental. it's not where you're walking out going, look at all this money I've made. It's just not there. So it's one of those things where, yeah, long-term discounts and low earnings is linked. So one of those things to watch for. And something I just picked up in my 6 month. So it's one of those things where I didn't notice that off the bat. It's probably a newbie mistake. It's one of those things where I would, unfortunately, I'd want to talk to a client. In other words, I guess this is how a long-term rental would probably work for me. If I had somebody who came in and did a 10-day rental and then said, "Hey, I want to move into a monthly," then I'd probably say, "Okay, well, let's discuss price," right? So I've got a bottom end price in mind for that, which would be just enough to cover costs and give me a little margin of maybe 10%, right? So we're not talking big numbers, but it's one of those things where I can't work below cost. It just doesn't. It's not going to fly. And I think that's where the underlying problem is when you're looking at Turo. Again, because they're a booking agent, they're not looking at your operational costs, or they're not looking at what your depreciation rate is. They're kind of hoping you don't, or you don't realize that. So it's one of those things you need to be aware of. It's a little bit of a con job in my mind from that standpoint. Would my car be more profitable as a short-term rental versus locking into a long-term discounted booking? So so we just talked about that. So yeah, definitely. Short-term is going to be better for you, but it's one of those little sweet spots where if you're going to do a daily, once you do your bookkeeping, in other words, you're going to put that little package together with all your rental information, and then once you prep the car to go out, and then once you prep the car when it comes back in, and then once you fuel it up, because they never come back full, they always have to get topped up, and you should charge for that. I do. So it's one of those things where you need to cover that expense of going back and forth for fuel. I don't charge for the clean up unless it's something horrible. So again, it's one of those things where these are things that you got to factor in. So a couple hours per car. So if you do a daily rental and you got to do a couple hours on the vehicle, it kind of washes that out. In other words, you're just getting paid for your time. Now, if you're going into a 3-day or a weekend rental, there's a 10% or a 20% discount sometimes associated with that. So that's not so bad, because you're going, okay, well, they're going to have that for 3 days. I'm not washing it every day. I'm only doing one draft on paperwork. So really, it's pretty straightforward. Like, that's the weekend stuff is pretty decent. The week or the 2-week rentals, which seems to be pretty common for what I describe as a regular Turo user who's using it for work, and they're using it as a way of offsetting the fact that they either can't get insurance, or they're using it as an offset that they're new to Canada and they just can't afford to get into a car at this point, or they don't get they're not yet at that point where they can get authorized for a loan to get into a proper car. So you're getting that little window there of new Canadians that find this to be very valuable. And again, because the insurance is reasonable. So the car is kind of, again, a giveaway to a certain extent on that standpoint. So I find that 10 days are excellent. And every time I've rented out to a student, they've always come back clean. I know there's that misconception out there, or that perceived conception, that you're renting it out to a college or a student that's new to Canada, that they're going to abuse the car, or smoke in it, or cause a whole. I haven't experienced that. So maybe it's just good luck on my end of it, but I've made that very clear. I've said, look, there's a $250 cleaning bill at the end of it. If it's filthy, I'm going to bill you. If it's got a little bit of mud on the mats, I'm not going to care, right? But it's one of those things where I make that very clear. And to the most part, they're really good about it. Now, I do have a GPS system in the vehicle. I would recommend that too. I will tell you that their driving habits are a little bit questionable. So again, young drivers, you can't really, they're paying a premium anyways for insurance. So if they did have an issue, you're covered, at least through Turo. So that's one of those things you should be aware of. So yeah, long-term, I would kind of say, be careful. Short-term seems to be okay. Plus, another nice thing is with short-term, if you did get one bad client, how much damage could they possibly do in 3 days on your car, or how much abuse could they really put on it? It's going to be minimum from that standpoint. I'm not doing that as a dare. I'm just saying that you rotate out, you're a little less risk of getting locked into something that's going to be a nightmare for you. Okay, tough customers. Oh yeah, this is the one that we need to talk about. Tough customer base and review system. So you just changed the review system. I think they will have to change it. It's going to be one of those things that you're going to see an exit, I think, on Turo. And I think what they really should do is have a tiered system. And unfortunately, no one seems to talk about that. But a tiered system would be my Mitsubishi Outlander is not in the same perceived category as a Enzo Ferrari. It's just not going to be, right? So in other words, if I were renting an exotic, like a super exotic, I would expect perfection, right? Because I'm paying a ton of money for it. Whereas if I'm renting a bread and butter minivan or a bread and butter, Cavalier, not Cavalier, would be a good example of a basic, just Honda Civic, right? My expectations are 8.5. Like the car doesn't have a check engine light on, it's clean, it's tidy, gas tank is full, doesn't smell bad. That really should be the benchmark for it, right? Reliable, comfortable. You know, it's not your 5-star hotel, it's a 3-star, right? You met the 3-star challenge. Like I really think that's where they should be going to. And I don't know if you've got to rebrand. In other words, you say, okay, these are the, and maybe that's what they're trying to do. Like, but I would separate. I would say, hey, look, this is our top tier. These are our, our exotics. These are our mid-range luxuries, and these are our bread and butter discounted cars to give you a transportation to and from work that are reliable and safe, clean and tidy, but level expectation, right? I think you need to control that. I think that's the problem with the review-based system. Plus, I had one client come back and tell me what the questions were, and the questions were ridiculous. So it's one of those things where you look at, you kind of go, I don't know what to tell Turo. There really isn't a feedback or anywhere really to say, hey, this is where you should be at. And to be honest with you, I don't think they'd listen to me because I'm like a host with one car. So small voice in a big room, right? As far as that's concerned. Market saturation and vehicle ROI. So here's how do I determine if my car model is still profitable in my market or has saturated driven prices too low? Okay. So this is in my market. I do have an issue. My Outlander is classed, I think, as an Outlander like it would be in the States. So the Outlander in the States is an RVR in Canada. The Outlander in Canada is the bigger vehicle. I don't know. I think they call the Outlander Sport, the RVR down there, and they call the Outlander the Outlander. So up here, because I think it's a US-driven software program, I get penalized because I don't get bill out as a 7-passenger. I'm stuck in that 5-passenger category when I do automated pricing. So that makes my vehicle, when it's in that category, almost not profitable. So I've got to go in and change my pricing to reflect what would be a Nissan Pathfinder or what would be in that 7-passenger category with a V6, right? So that's one of those things that I found in the last 4 months to be an issue. Saturated prices, yeah, I'm going to say, yeah, the prices have dropped down a fair bit. But it's one of those things that you look at, you kind of go, it's the market. Like January is really quiet. February, I think, is going to be pretty quiet. It's not a booming rental market right now. When I go by my rental place, they still have cars in the drive. GM still has loaner vehicles in place. So clearly the market is slow. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to say, okay, again, as a hobby, you want to be able to cover a few costs on your car. Probably not a bad choice for the small guy that's just out there. If you said, hey, I've cracked the egg and I want to go ahead and I want to make myself a beautiful breakfast out of the whole thing, get some sausages going, have 4 cars rolling, and make a real business out of it. There's a 4-car limit on Turo, incidentally, up here in Canada. I think that's, if you were going to go mid-range, not necessarily luxury cars, but Lincolns and things, I think you'd probably do okay if you were in a bigger market. But in my neck of the woods, I think you'd have a struggling point with that. Are some vehicle types no longer available for rentals based on declining demand and pricing trends? Well, I made a decision to get rid of my Cruise because the pricing structure on it and the demand for it wouldn't cover insurance. So yeah, I think that's going to be one of those things where if I were out there with a car and my intent was to try and make it pay for itself, there are certain vehicles I would probably avoid. And maybe I'll do a video on that and say, hey, look, just based on ROI, and not necessarily that the car's bad or there's an issue with it. It's just that it wouldn't turn enough profit to be able to get it out there. Turo's calculator does not provide a good reflection on ROI. So if you're using that, forget about it. I use ChatGTP. They've got it came up with a formula that's really good. So it took my insurance cost, it took my monthly cost for maintenance, it took average declining rate over the last 3 years on my model. So in other words, factor all that in. It basically spit me out a number and said, hey, This is the bottom end number you need to rent your car for. So ChatGTP, put your information in. It's free. Use it. I found it to be night and day better over the calculator at Turo. So that's my opinion on that one. So maybe you've had luck with it. I don't think it works very well at all. Limited control over pricing and margins. Okay, so yeah, so here's Turo's automated pricing, and the pricing is a little bit weird. It's strange because on certain models, it's pretty decent. So when you're doing a little research there, you're going to go, oh, well, a good example is I'm looking at Land Rovers. So the Land Rover Evoque, I can buy one between 12 and 18,000, 2015 to 2018, with reasonably low kilometers, safety, and properly serviced, that type of deal. So I'm probably going to get 6 months to a year out of it without having to do anything major. So it's almost $100 to $140 daily on a rental. My Outlander was about $10,000, and I'm between 45 and 75 on rental. So really, just for a little margin more in the way of expense on the car, I could almost double my Turo rental. So it's one of those things you need to look at. Now, the insurance on that little guy, because it's a higher end car, does increase, but it's offset by the actual rental cost. So it's one of those things where, you do need to kind of sit back and go over models and see if it works. If you're out there just buying a car literally for Turo, it's one of those things where you want to sit there for a couple of days, and even with ChatGTP, just go through a couple of models and say, okay, so what would be my bottom end costs on that car, factoring in these little things like insurance, depreciation, maintenance, things along that line. Turo has a list there, stuff to review, but I'd probably be doing that. And the other one is I'd be looking at rotating out. So like, for instance, my Outlander, 6 months is kind of the review point, and I'm going to go and get it inspected. It won't need anything. It'll be fine from that standpoint. But if it did, then I'm going to do a safety. So I might as well just do a safety. At that point, I might as well list the car. So if I paid for a number, $10,000, and I can get $9,000 for it right now, and it's safety and ready to go, did I lose $1,000? Well, no, because I did some rentals in between or things along that line. So I've offset that, and I've made a little bit of money. So is it a ton of money? No, but it gives me an opportunity to rotate out, maybe move into a Land Rover, or just switch out vehicles just for a change, that type of thing. And that might be where, if you're running that second vehicle, you're going to get to a point where you're going to go, geez, I need tires, brakes, front end work, things along that line. You might want to just pull the old cord on it and say goodbye and go get yourself something a little newer, or something with less maintenance or lower kilometers. But that'd be a judgment on your call. Again, with mine, it's kind of like, if I need to do brakes, I'm okay with that. If I need to do ball joint or a tie rod, I'm fine with that. But if I'm going to get to the point where I'm starting to deal with bigger things, and with Mitsubishi, a nice thing is the parts are pretty reasonable. They were originally built for a 10-year warranty, so they're pretty resilient on things. So it's one of those things where I feel very comfortable with that car going a little longer. But it's one of those items where you'd have to review that. Risk of vehicle misuse and damage. So what security measures should I have in place to protect against theft, damage, or fraudulent renters? Yeah, I'm new. So it's one of those things where I've had a struggling point with this as well. You're kind of going with like your eyes wide open and pretty paranoid and a little glitchy about the whole thing. I put a GPS system in mind so I could kind of track a little bit. So far, all the stuff that I thought would happen hasn't. Most folks that I've had in the vehicle have been very pleasant, very careful with it. So I'd probably say that's probably a smaller percentage. Fraudulent renters, again, because they have to go through the Turo system and they're vetted through those guys, they're liable. You have to check the driver's license and confirm everything. But again, it's on Turo if they really kind of messed up on the fraudulent end of it. Against theft, you're insured. So again, if the vehicle goes missing, you're covered. So it's not really an issue from that standpoint. Damage is the more annoying thing, because a lot of times it's nickel and dime stuff that's going to be irritants than anything else. Like a ding that's going to cost you $75 from a paintless dent repair guy. You're not going to claim that through Turo because it's just too much of a hassle. So you're going to go out of pocket on that one. So I put a little percentage on each rental aside for little stuff like that. So by the end of the year, I've set aside maybe $500 for dents and dings and mild repairs, right? So I'm okay on that end of it, but it's one of those things you should review. Specific warning signs that indicate high-risk rentals before accepting a booking. Well, so this is a problem. So a lot of my renters, I have no reviews. And I guess you got to start somewhere, but it's one of those things where, yeah, there isn't really a way of vetting these folks as far as that's concerned. You have to kind of go by Turo, and to be honest with you, I don't think Turo vets them very well. So there's a risk involved in that. So again, it's one of those things where I use a point to point. I don't really meet the renter from that standpoint, so I'm a little disconnected from that, which I think is probably a good thing. Again, it's hard to predict. You can't tell who's going to be abusing your car just by visually looking at them. And again, I haven't had any bad reviews, but I haven't seen any reviews. So it's one of those things where I've been getting like first time out type deal, which may not be a bad thing because they're trying to get a decent review to keep going. Competitions, alternative platforms. There really isn't anything in Canada, so it isn't really worth talking about from that standpoint. There really isn't another place to go for higher margins, so you're kind of stuck with Turo. It's just the nature of it. Legal and regulatory risks. Okay, so I think you're okay from that standpoint as long as you stay along with Turo's usages, so you're fine from there. So hopefully that helps you out a little bit. Just general questions. We're at 45 minutes. I try and keep these at 30, so we're gonna basically say goodbye. And again, hit the subscribe button. I greatly appreciate it. Have a pleasant and enjoyable day.